This morning is Monday. Yesterday we got done with church and realized we hadn't pressed record on the camera. So we're coming back on Monday, and I wanted to share with you what we had yesterday. In case you're following along with us in our series through Ephesians, I didn't want you to miss out on anything. So we're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 4 this morning. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and take a second to open up. And while you're doing that, I wanted to talk about just a few people through history, quite a few people really. In the 1800s, George Mueller lived in Bristol, England, after a cholera epidemic, and he started orphanages around England that would care for over 10,000 orphan and abandoned children. In 1924, Eric Liddell won the Olympic gold medal in Paris, France. And one of the cool things about his story is his event was the 100-meter dash, but he actually refused to run it in the Olympics because it was run on Sunday, and instead he ran the 400-meter. He still won a gold medal, so that's pretty cool. William Wilberforce was a member of England's Parliament in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and he worked endlessly for the abolition of slavery. Robert Reichs in the 1700s, again in England, started schools for poor children and factory worker children who otherwise wouldn't have been able to receive an education. He's known today as the founder of Sunday school, what many of our churches have on Sunday morning before or after, maybe during service, is a result of somebody who wanted to start an education based on the Bible. George Washington Carver was an African-American chemist who won the Roosevelt Medal in 1939 for his research on peanuts and sweet potatoes. And as you can imagine, for an African-American to win a medal like that in the 1930s would have been extremely difficult, and he had to overcome, really difficult circumstances because his parents were both slaves. Johann Sebastian Bach is one of the most well-known composers of all time. I would imagine you've probably heard something by him, whether you realize it or not. Michelangelo was one of the most famous artists of all time, known for a lot of his biblical portraits. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, two incredibly famous authors who gave us The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia, who are both inspired by Christian principles. Fanny Crosby was a blind musician during the 1800s who wrote 8,000 hymns, including Blessed Assurance and Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior. Florence Nightingale trained and organized nursing care during the Crimean War, which led to what we now have as modern nursing care in a lot of our hospitals. Susan B. Anthony was an abolitionist and a fighter for women's rights. Corrie ten Boom was this awesome woman in Dutch Holland who, or during World War II, and she, after Holland had been taken over by the Germans, she helped dozens, if not hundreds, of Jews escape. She was later put into a concentration camp herself. But what do all these people have in common? What do they have in common? A calling. And we're no different, right? Every one of us has a calling on our lives, but the biggest difference is that we may not be famous, right? Some of us may not lean into that calling the way that others do. Some may not be put in the spotlight the way others are. But as Christians, we're all called to glorify God. And as we've talked about the last few weeks, we're all called to make the mystery of the gospel known to the world around us, right? And that may seem like a long list of people. It may seem a bit unnecessary, but the point of all those people, listing all those people, is this: it doesn't matter who you are, right? It doesn't matter whether you're a scientist or an author, an Olympic runner or an artist, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or a factory worker. We all have a calling to bring God into the world that we live in. So this morning I wanted to jump into this passage, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. And this is the word of the Lord through Paul in Ephesians 4. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. I particularly like the way that the ESV starts the first verse where it says, therefore. And there's a saying in the Bible that goes, anytime you see the word therefore, you should look to see what it's there for, right? Why is that therefore placed where it is? But this therefore, or if you're reading it in the NIV, it says then, separates the first 3 chapters from the second 3 chapters. The first 3 chapters have been spent communicating to us God's story. What was done by Christ, what the church ought to be because of that. If you read back, if you take some time, maybe today or later this week, to read back through those first 3 chapters, you'll be reminded of God's story and everything that He's done, particularly through Christ. And then kind of like the establishment of the church. But the second 3 chapters are spent explaining what life should look like, both as individuals and as the church. Chapter 3, or chapter 4, 5, and 6 really start to get into some of those nitty-gritty, practical application type things. So these next few weeks, we're going to be looking at those to see what it is specifically that we're supposed to do. What are we called to do? How are we called to do it? How can we stay faithful to that calling? So verse 1 challenges us to live a life worthy of the calling that we have received. The ESV says, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. That calling, to some degree, has been laid out already in the first 3 chapters. Now we'll begin to look at what that walk looks like exactly. Each week for the next couple weeks, we're going to be going into some of these specifics, and hopefully some of those things that we're doing as a church accomplish that. And hopefully also we're challenged to dive deeper in some ways where we may be falling short. But right away, Paul offers some instructions for individuals. So that's where we're going to start today. What can we as individuals do to make sure that we're living a life worthy of this calling that God has placed on us? And in verse 2 through 3 really is what we're going to be looking at for the most part today. So what are those components to live a life worthy of the calling that Christ has placed on us? Right, what are those components to live a life worthy of the calling that Christ has placed on us? The first piece is humility. Right, verse 2 tells us that we need to be completely humble and gentle. So we'll get into gentle in a minute, but first humble. And the Greek word meant to have a lowliness of mind, which to the Gentiles was seen as a bad thing. People outside the church, the Romans, the Greeks, the Ephesians, people that Paul was writing to, may have seen this as a bad thing. To have this lowliness of mind wouldn't have been a virtue that they strived for. Right? It meant that people saw themselves as less, but the early Christians saw it as a virtue. To them, it meant seeing themselves as they were, not as something more than what they were. It meant keeping things in the right perspective. Right? They weren't elevating themselves to a God status. They weren't somehow morally more or morally better than anyone else. They realized that they were all sinners, saved by grace, and therefore were empowered to work hard together to do whatever was necessary to preach the gospel to anyone with ears to hear what they had to say. The people that they ministered to varied from Roman centurions to alleyway beggars. Right? The spectrum was huge, and there was no distinctions made about who was better or who was worse. It didn't matter. They saw all people as equals, and that just wasn't common during their time. Today, what does it look like to live with humility? What does it mean to see ourselves as we are, to see ourselves through God's eyes? And how does that change the way that we serve each other and the way that we serve people in our communities? The second component, or the second virtue maybe, to living a life worthy of the calling that Christ has placed on our lives is gentleness, right? Paul says to be completely humble and gentle. And it's this very similar idea to humility. It meant to have a mild disposition, a gentleness of spirit. And again, it's not something that people outside of the Christian world, outside the Christian church, would have admired. It wasn't a virtue that they would have strived for. But it takes a certain strength to minister to people who don't want to hear it, or people who think that they're better than you. Right? Some of you may know exactly what I'm talking about. I've had plenty of people who I've talked to about faith outside the church who think I'm small-minded to believe in God. Who think it's narrow-minded and ignorant to believe that there is a God out there who created the world, created you and I, who created everything that we see, and who is able to change events and control events. And at times, it can be incredibly hard to be kind to people who think you're ignorant because of your faith, right? Maybe you've dealt with this before. Maybe you've had that same thought or that same experience. And what the outside world sees as weakness may be better understood as meekness, which, the way that I understand it, is the ability to bear difficulties in relationships like that, right? For the good of someone else, to sometimes be considered the lesser person and to be okay with that, because ultimately it could result in that other person's salvation. Are you okay in a situation, whether it's with a coworker or maybe it's with a family member, of them thinking less of you, or maybe thinking that you're not as good as them because they have some sort of knowledge that you don't? Are you okay to be perceived as lesser in order for them to come to know Christ? Because I think that's what this idea of gentleness is coming to, right? And I think that's something that we tend to struggle with at times, right? Are you someone who you would consider to be gentle in spirit or meek? Are you someone who's able to let themselves be considered less than others in order for that person to be elevated so that hopefully they would come to know Christ, to be in a better spot? The third component that Paul brings to the table is patience. Right? The second half of verse 2 says, "Be patient, bearing with one another in love." And just like we need to be humble and gentle with people outside of the church, we need to be patient with each other in the church. Paul uses the same word or idea in other parts of his writing, and usually he's talking about this idea of enduring suffering, which I thought was really interesting, that Paul talks about this idea of enduring suffering with patience, and he talks about doing life in community with patience. Maybe it relates to suffering, I don't know, but what I take away from that is that life within community isn't a walk in the park, right? Every community is going to have its difficulties, even the church. Sometimes it seems like, especially the church. Right, we all see things from a different perspective. We all come from different backgrounds. We come from different experiences. We have different thought processes. We have different circumstances that have led us to know life in a different way. So we all have different preferences. We have different needs. And as a result, conflicts can arise. But how do we deal with it? How do we choose to deal with those conflicts? When Paul talks about the idea of church, he paints a picture of unity. And here in verse 2, he tells us to be patient, to bear with one another in love. And I think one of the keys to patience is perspective. Whose perspective do we choose to see? Right? In order to be patient and to approach every situation with love, we need to see through two perspectives before we see through our own. Right? The first perspective we need to see through other than ours is that person who we disagree with. We need to try to have empathy to see things through the perspective that the people who we disagree with across the aisle from, we have to understand how they see those things. We have to understand that because we have different lives, because we've come from different circumstances, because we deal with different struggles, we see things in different ways. And those things that we deal with shape the way that we view life. They shape the way that we view God. They shape the way we view the church. And if we would be able to sit down and choose to try to empathize and see through the other person's perspective, we would understand that it's not just disagreement for the sake of disagreement, that it's disagreement based on something that is very real and that has changed that person. So the first perspective that we need to see through is the people that we disagree with. That second perspective, and I think the more important perspective, is that we need to see it through God's perspective. Right? And in order to see things through God's perspective, we need to read the Bible. We need to be in prayer. We need to worship consistently. And right now, maybe that's a tricky thing because we're not all in church every week. Maybe you're joining me with online, and maybe you have been for the last 5-6 months. And that's okay. We know during these times things are really different and difficult. But how are you choosing to get into the Word, to pray, to worship, to stay connected with God so that you can continue to see things through His perspective? Because when we talk about bearing with one another, having patience with one another, the way that really happens is by seeing things through each other's perspective and seeing things through God's perspective, allowing these to form a conversation so that we can move forward together. And the fourth thing that Paul tells us is to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Every effort. And I think this is where it gets particularly difficult, because this means that when you get to the end of your rope, when you feel like that person has rubbed you the wrong way for the last time and you're just done with them, right? That's just maybe with something that's been happening for so long. They've just gotten on your nerves for the last time. It means you still need to choose to respond in love. And that at times can be difficult, right? You still have to choose to strive for peace. And what does that look like? Most of the time, it looks selfless, right? It literally means seeing less of ourselves, seeing more of others, and more of God in every situation. Right? Christ came to give Himself so that we could be reconciled to Him, so that He could establish peace between Gentiles and Jews. And now we must continue to give of ourselves to maintain that bond of peace. And that's why the first 3 chapters of Ephesians are so important as we move into the next 3 chapters, because it's been God's story. It's this idea of Christ giving Himself for the church so that unity could be established between Jews and Gentiles, so that it could be established between different believers, and that same thing continues today. Right? We have to give of ourselves to maintain that bond of peace. And it's sacrificial and it's difficult on a regular basis. And our glorification may not come until our resurrection. Right? And that's a hard fact for many of us to accept, especially in America, where we're told that we can be whatever we want to be and achieve whatever we set our minds to. To be Christian means to be sacrificial until death, even into death. And I think that at times is a challenge. The way that Paul words, make every effort, also carries with it a sense of urgency. And often, the best way to keep peace is to seek it early, right? Seek peace early. And I think that there's something that a lot of communities, whether it's workplaces, or maybe it's a block in your neighborhood, or maybe it's your church, we tend to have issues, right? Things come up, conflicts arise, and how do we deal with those? Right? I think this is something that's particularly true in the church. But when we have issues with something, whether it's a change or it's an attitude or, I don't know, the way somebody dresses or the music that we choose, whatever it might be, we need to confront the person who we have an issue with first, not everyone else, right? It's easy to talk to other people who agree with us about the problem, and it's difficult to face the issue head on a lot of times. Right? It's so much easier to talk about these things that with people who we agree with, because we know they're going to agree with us. It's not going to be hard. But as soon as we have to have that conversation with that person who disagrees with us, it might get a little bit difficult. But when we don't have that conversation with that person, we go around talking about it with everyone else, it just serves to get us more worked up, and that issue grows even larger than what it needs to in our minds, and it makes peace harder to achieve, right? And I think that's something that, for the most part, we do pretty well here at Harrietta. I think we tend to have conversations early, so that's something that, especially if you're a part of our church, I want to encourage you in. I think you're doing a good job. But I also want to challenge us and encourage us to continue seeking that, to seek it more, to always go to each other when we have issues. Because when you sit down and you try to see things through another person's perspective, when you look at the situation through God's perspective and you have that conversation, you begin to understand the people who you worship with, the people who you live with every week. And when you begin to see those people for who they are and the circumstances that they've been through and how those things shape who they are as a person, it begins to help you appreciate why they have the views and the opinions that they do. And suddenly these issues that maybe seemed so big aren't as big. Maybe you can appreciate and maybe even learn to love their side, and vice versa. So I want to encourage you, if you're at our church, I think this is something that's going well, and challenge you to continue doing that. And if you're not a part of our church, maybe you're tuning in, maybe this has become part of your routine, I want to challenge you to make this a part of your church's culture, to always go to the people that you have issues with and encourage other people to do the same. Right? Loving conversations between people who disagree usually lead to a deeper understanding of our circumstances, our ideas, and they generally lead to a more peaceful outcome. But waiting too long or getting too many people involved in that issue only leads to cause greater division. Very rarely does it help us to draw closer together. Paul wraps up verses 4-6 by talking about the one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God that we're all a part of. Which for me further goes to establish this unity that we've been called to as a church. Right? At the end of the day, we all serve one God. We're all saved by one faith. And we're all striving for that one same goal, which is to see the mystery of the gospel, right? The love of Christ revealed to as many people as possible. It doesn't matter if you're Methodist, Baptist, Christian Reformed, Catholic, Wesleyan, Pentecostal, Calvinist, or Arminianist. We're all called to the same hope and the same salvation by grace through faith. So when we leave today, or when you listen to this morning, this afternoon, tonight, whenever it is that you're listening to this, let's all strive to be humble and gentle in heart to be patient, to bear with one another in love, to serve the greater goals of Christ, so that the multitudes of people beyond our church walls would come to see who it is that we serve and come to know the gospel that we've all been saved by. Let's pray. God, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning, to deliver this message again. And I pray that whoever hears it, whoever listens to it, would be drawn into a deeper relationship with you. I pray that you would strengthen us to go out into the world to establish peace. That the bond of peace that Christ died to make a reality between the Jews and Gentiles would be a bond of peace that we continue to make a reality in our communities. I pray that we would be gentle, that we would be humble, and that we would be patient with one another as we go through our lives. I pray that you give us the strength to deal with conflicts, with peace and unity. And I pray that in everything that we do, we may glorify you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for joining us. Whenever it is that you tune in to check this out, and we hope that our ministry here at Harrietta is one that encourages you, lifts you up, and draws you closer in your relationship with Christ. Have a great week.